welcome to the Temple Mount Podcast. My name is Shogun. Joining me again today is my good friend Giovanni Dark. And today we are going to discuss suppressed technology and all of the very interesting aspects of that. But before we do, make sure you've joined us on the Temple Mount Discord server where we record these podcasts every day. And make sure you've followed and subscribed to our channels on YouTube, BitChute, SoundCloud, and Odyssey, all of which you can find in the Temple Mount Discord server. That being said, welcome, Giovanni. Thank you for joining me. How are you today, sir?
Lovely. Grateful to be back. Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure. So, suppressed technology, classified aircraft, free energy. Where are we going to start with this? Where do you want to begin the journey?
Well, the truth of the matter is, if one wishes to discuss suppressed technology, you'd have to indeed find a question of exactly where indeed. There's, of course, the question of medical, there's the question of energy, there's the question of a whole host of different technologies, even if they're on a matter of simple discovery. But if I were to start anywhere, I would actually prefer to start in my own personal journey, because as someone who lived a life where most people were not necessarily as interested in some of the same topics as I had been, it had always led me to a path of great curiosity. Esoterics always have a desire to find truth. I'm sure you will relate very well to this. But if we are to examine maybe some of the first technology that I had discovered a long time ago, it actually began with a fascinating concept, one that we were always told was, quote, impossible, which is, of course, free energy. And of course, that's a bit of a rabbit hole in and of itself. But I would say, to be absolutely fair, if one is willing to look at all the evidence and put aside all kinds of notions of established laws or dogmas, what we find is that, believe it or not, there have been literally hundreds of inventors over the past likely century and a half, whom themselves have succeeded in one way or another in being able to create a machine that actually succeeds in producing more energy out than is externally put in. And the first problem that people run into with this concept is the dogma that they're often told, which is you can't derive more out of something than you put in. But I belong to a different way of examining the universe, which dictates, just as Tesla believed, that energy is all around us at all times, and the ability to harness that energy at all times is not impossible. As a matter of fact, the implosion technology, which is simple and it's serene, it does not involve combustion, explosion, fire, or impetus, which dominates the current thinking or belief of what energy is. It's very different, absolutely different. And one of the first examples of so-called perpetual motion, which in and of itself is a term that I myself don't generally care for, because it implies that something has to be moving at all times. Well, there are several free energy machines that exist and have been proven to exist and are in use by certain groups of people in secret today, even though they are willing to show their results, that require no movement at all. But the first machine has been dated to go back to what we would think of as ancient India. That is what's called the Bhaskara wheel. The Bhaskara wheel is a simple methodology of using gravity in a cycle to keep a wheel in a system of overbalance. Now, Bhaskara himself, the mathematician, originally simply used vials of mercury. Now, obviously, today we don't need the mercury, we can simply do it with water. But there have been those who've succeeded in actually creating Bhaskara's wheel, a simple wheel that, as the wheel turns, the gravity is always shifting the water in a motion to make one side of the wheel heavier than the other. And it cycles over and over and over again, keeping the wheel in perpetual motion. But this isn't even the best, not nearly the best, form of endless energy. that humanity has been able to do. Now, there was a gentleman whom actually succeeded in creating a large Ferris wheel-sized version of Bhaskara's wheel. Only instead of using a liquid, it used a series of weights and pulleys. But the wheel keeps on turning. It was built in France, specifically. We can watch a clip on it later. But the overbalance wheel is just the beginning. Once humanity discovers electricity, which I will assert is not the only form of power. Most people today think that electricity is really the only form of current that we can derive out of a machine, but it's actually only one of two. But we can go into that later. Tesla himself actually succeeded in creating a system which, even though people to this day continue to deny it and say, oh, it's a hoax, it's not real, well, no, it is real. Tesla succeeded in accomplishing on a much greater scale something that others are just beginning to do today, which is the ability to convert ambient radio frequencies that are constantly abuzz and waving throughout the airwaves at all times, capturing them with an antenna and being able to convert them directly into power. He succeeded in creating a car, an electric car, that did nothing more than capture radio signals, converting them directly into power to charge the battery, and he drove all over upstate New York in the early 20th century without ever having to stop or recharge by simply capturing the endless radio waves that were bouncing around him. And this is just one example. We also see an example of how so-called atmospheric motors work today, that simply require one to take a large antenna and hoist it into the air. It's important to understand that without understanding the ether, or aether if you're English, without understanding the ether, it's impossible to understand what power is, and what energy is, and what a field is, and without establishing what these are and understanding them, just as I have learned from as he calls himself, Theoria Apophasis, or Ken Wheeler. His work has been able to enlighten me to being able to explain a great multitude of these machines and how they were able to function in the past. For many years before I learned about the ether and how it actually functions, I understood through nothing more than evidence by itself, real evidence by itself. I understood that these machines clearly worked, but I was never able to understand how they were functioning because they seemed to exist outside the realm of conventional science. After I learned the ether's mechanics, it finally dawned on me as to how these were actually functioning. Now, unfortunately, before I go any farther, and I would like to play a clip in a moment, unfortunately, apart from Tesla himself, a great multitude of the men who came after him had concocted a whole series of different theories in order to explain how their machines functioned. But because these men were educated in atomism, which is the current predominant belief system of science, they were unable to create a 100% clear and consistent theory based on true fidelity. And so as a result, what you have are a series of machines that in truth do indeed function, but the theory behind their function is half right and half wrong. I'm speaking specifically of a whole host of inventors that we'll go through briefly in just a moment. John Searle, Don Smith, Marco Rodin, and Joe Newman. Each of these men succeeded in creating something that truly was remarkable and had indeed been verified by a whole host of established, respectable professionals, engineers, heads of energy, even NASA scientists. Joe Newman's machine alone was endorsed by one of the makers of the atomic bomb, Dr. E.L. Meringue. So it's quite clear that obviously these machines function, but what is the implication? We can go into that in just a moment. One of the, and before I play this clip, what you have in these men's theories, being half right and half wrong, is a modicum of truth as far as something that is occurring within the invention in order to bring about this special result, but the explanation itself is not entirely there. For example, Joe Newman was wise enough to discover that a magnet's field, because of course his machine relies on magnets to function. Joe Newman's theory is half accurate and half wrong because he is mistaking something, and what I'm talking about specifically is this. He was correct in his assertion that every magnetic field oscillates and spins, just as every atom in the universe oscillates and spins like that of a gyroscope. Every one spins like a gyroscope. However, his discovery was a correct observation, but a mistaken answer, or a mistaken conclusion. He believed that the gyromagnetic precession, or he mistakened the gyromagnetic, gyro like gyro, the gyro or gyromagnetic precession, which means to spin, of the magnet's field was the work of a so-called gyroscopic particle. That's false. It's not a particle at all. It's the field, not a BB in action. Now, many of these machines that we'll see, and I'm pulling up a clip right now that we will play, but his machine also established something that was very peculiar that a lot of people, and I don't necessarily want to dwell on he alone too long, but I will say this in his defense before I play some of these clips from the documentary Newman, which is all about him, obviously. He died in 2015, but I would argue that there has never been an inventor yet, or before or since, who's had more professionals, more men of illustrious and grandiose titles, heads of industry, engineers, and a whole host of countless experts, many of whom were skeptics before they met him, and after they had the time to freely and collectively or even individually examine his machine, became devout believers. Many of these men had to eat their words. And without dwelling on him too long, the fact of the matter is, there has never been an inventor with more backers and more men of clout and strong reputation to defend him and his machine and state unequivocally that, yes, this is real. This is not a hoax. This is not make-believe. This is the beginning of something absolutely revolutionary in the history of man. And in spite of Joe Newman's success, I do not personally care for his machine only because it requires moving parts, and I would argue that there are some free energy machines that do exist that require no moving parts. Specifically, the Don Smith device and the Lester Hendershot device. Now, before we go on, I'd like to play a clip from the documentary Newman. But as we do so, I encourage everyone, to go take the time, please, for all intents and purposes, don't take my word for it, take the experts' names, take their word for it. These are the men whom are at least alive when this documentary was made. Joe Newman has since passed. It documents the adequate history of this machine, its inventor, and his eventual rise to a prominence in the scientific, at least some level of its community, until eventually he was destroyed. And oftentimes people ask, well, why would someone go out of their way to destroy such a man? Why would one seek to do this? But that's a deeper question that I'd like to address before, or excuse me, a deeper question that I'd like to address after I've covered a number of these free energy machines before we move on to a different type of suppressed technology, because free energy is not going to be the only type of suppressed technology that we discuss tonight. So if you'll give me a moment, I'm going to pull up the clip. Here we go.
Anyone who has spent 10 or 15 years doing something, dedicating their life to it, there's a good chance that person can come up with a revolutionary creative thought simply because that they'll look at it from a different standpoint than what everybody else has.
When I was doing those reports, I would get very, very angry letters, angry phone calls from engineers, scientists, saying that I was making a mockery of science or engineering.
They either are in denial, or they refuse to even look at it, consider it.
No, I imagine some people don't want to get involved for fear of stirring up animosity.
If science is engineer, I'd disprove that damn thing. Because funding, publicity, grants, I want that for science, not cockamamie ideas like this.
For whatever reason, it wasn't working out, you know. Joe was asking them to admit to something that's physically impossible, and they had their reputation at stake.
In August of this year, Joseph Newman called one of the premier instrumentation firms in the world. He requested that engineers be sent to his home to make sure the testing equipment he had purchased from that company was working properly. On August 24th, 2 engineers tested the equipment and Mr. Newman's machine. After testing the Newman device for 5 hours, one of the engineers called me. He said the machine is simply incredible. It does exactly as the inventor claims. He then offered a letter and the test results. Plus, he and his partner agreed to an interview. But the next day, company representatives called WWL to say there would be no letter, no interviews, and the company's name should not be used. Shortly thereafter, the 2 engineers asked us not to use their name for fear of being fired.
Well,
now, that is something substantial in and of itself. The question here that we're seeing is, why would people do that? Later on in the documentary, they address Newman's court case, and I'd like to close the Newman case for just a moment with this statement by saying, later on in his life, when he had pushed very, very hard for this invention, along with many, many backers, the court calls before itself what's called a court master. Now, not everyone knows what a court master is. When a judge, especially in a patent trial, requires an expert in something that they themselves are not proficiently knowledgeable within, they call in the court master. The court master, excuse me, the court master then examined Mr. Newman's device. And not only did he approve it with flying colors, he even went as far as to say, I strongly and highly recommend, Your Honor, to please grant Mr. Newman his patent. And the judge still shot it down. Now, why is this? If we examine a trend that happens with all these different pieces of technology, even a man named John Searle, who's an Englishman, and his invention plays a role not simply in free energy, but in anti-gravity, believe it or not. And we'll address that in a few moments. But virtually every one of these inventors always meet a similar fate. They attempt to push hard for their inventions, they gather the experts who examine the machines, and become believers only for misfortune, bad circumstance, or bureaucracies to simply step in and irrationally crush these people. But one has to be willing to beg the question, why is this happening? And the answer is quite simple. Free energy would do nothing less than change the whole makeup of human civilization forever. And that's not my opinion. That's the opinion of mainstream science. It would unlock for us, as human beings, the limitless potential to accomplish Herculean nothing short of Herculean tasks, including the ability to create matter from nothing. Even as recently as maybe a year or so ago, maybe even two, scientists succeeded in creating hydrogen atoms from light, actually using light to spawn in hydrogen atoms into the universe. But this did not make any great mainstream. It made some level of wavelength in the world of science, but it should have made front page news everywhere, because I would argue that it completely demolishes several established scientific beliefs and dogmas, especially regarding the so-called conservation of energy. When energy is limitless and everywhere, it's a bit difficult to so-called conserve it. One must understand that. However, I would also like to point in the direction of John Searle. Now, there are limitless. Before I move on to John Searle, I would like to express strongly that there are literally many, a whole host of different inventors of all sorts who've succeeded in creating some form of free energy or not. Well, excuse me, some form of free energy in one manner or another. And as a matter of fact, in Switzerland, to this day, there is a small isolated Christian community called the Merthenitha community. It was established in the 1980s by one Paul Baumann. This community has actually been running and powering itself exclusively on a giant Wimshurst motor that they call the Testatica. Since the 80s, the whole town has run on this machine, and only this machine, for decades. And every expert that goes there to examine it has come away stumped. And that's a quote from the actual documentary. And they call this the Testatica. With that in mind, I'd like to play this particular clip. Let me bring it up. Now, this original program, if anyone is curious in watching it, it's called Free Energy, The Race to Zero Point. It is a bit dated, but its information is very strong and remains powerful even to this day.
Most people would agree you can't get something for nothing. There's no such thing as a free lunch. And yet, we get our oxygen free from the air we breathe. We get sunlight free, and water, that used to be free until bottled drinking water came along. But what about energy? We've always had to pay for that, whether it's wood or coal, oil or electricity. It's always been the rule that you can never get back more energy than what you put in the first place. That's a fundamental law of nature. Physicists of the 19th century figured that out with the first law of thermodynamics, the conservation of energy. Maybe so. But science has come a long way since then. And laws? Well, there's never been one that hasn't been broken.
Now we will move on. We will move on to a later point. This section specifically deals with a student of Tesla's named Moray.
Was a revolutionary book written by T. Henry Moray.
Let's go back just one moment.
The Sea of Energy in Which the Earth Floats was a revolutionary book written by T. Henry Moray, an electrical engineer and Tesla enthusiast who in the early 20s began working on a device he claimed intercepted radiant energy from outer space. His solid-state detector, the Moray valve, was designed with a complex series of semiconductors, high-voltage capacitors, and transformers hooked up to an antenna and a ground wire. By stimulating the existing oscillations of space energy, his radiant energy device ran for days, putting out 50 kilowatts of electricity. His public demonstrations attracted newspaper coverage and scientists from Bell Laboratories and the Department of Agriculture's Rural Electrification Administration. Although no one could find evidence of fraud, neither could anyone explain how the radiant energy device worked. During the 30s, he developed semiconductors and transistors that were far ahead of their time. Unfortunately, as all too many inventors have suffered, when he refused to sell out to powerful interests, Moray and his family were threatened, shot at, and their laboratory ransacked. Ignored by the U.S. Patent Office, Moray quietly stopped public disclosure of the device after it was destroyed by his assistant, Felix Frazier, a communist sympathizer who was frustrated when Moray declined his repeated offers to take that technology to Russia.
Now, that's just one example of a whole series of others. However, I had mentioned the Testotica before. I would like to play this clip because, again, I encourage others, please, take a look at these. They're interesting. And even if one doesn't necessarily understand it, it's worth exploration.
There's electricity in the air. It's a common expression and one that's true. Take a comb, run it through your hair on a dry day, and you can get a static shock. Sure, it's electricity, all right, but could it also be tapped to produce sufficient energy we could all use?
Benjamin Franklin is credited as being the inventor of the electrostatic motor back in the 1700s, but its power output was modest. The Wimshurst electrostatic generator is a high-voltage mechanism developed in the 1800s, which can be hand or self-started and will produce dramatic sparking while charging Leyden jars.
For the record, I've had a chance to actually play with one of those.
Today, it's used in teaching about electricity, but its practical applications are considered inconsequential. A high-tech variation of the Wimshurst device is the Testotica, or Swiss ML converter. Developed by Paul Baumann of the Maternita community in Switzerland during the 70s, this free energy device is a marvel that has been in operation for more than 20 years, supplying electricity to the small, self-sufficient Christian community. Many technical experts have come away stumped by its excess output. However, because the community feels that the majority of mankind is not ready to be responsible for such unlimited energy, they're keeping the technology under wraps until such time the world is spiritually prepared. Other researchers, like Dr. Oleg Jefamenko,
whom himself wrote many important books,
continue to pursue real-world applications for harnessing the electrostatic motor.
His accomplishment, I feel, is the best, is that he used a specific type of electret, which is a waxy substance which holds charge, and it's like in many ways a magnet, electrical analog of a magnet. And he's achieved a 0.1 horsepower motor, which is a small device. And this runs continually on atmospheric electricity.
What one thinks of as so-called atmospheric electricity, or so-called static, or when one rubs a balloon on their head and actually sees the hair move around when the balloon comes close to the hair, that's not actually electricity. We tend to think of it as electricity, but that is actually dielectricity, which in and of itself is another form of power. Now, some people may actually be familiar with there was a gentleman named C.P. Steinmetz. He is considered one of Tesla's equals, and in some people believing that he was actually a little bit wiser than Tesla when it came to creating AC generators. However, he is most credited today as being the inventor of the coaxial cable that we use in all of our modems for our internet to this day. He was a very smart man. His name again was C.P. Steinmetz. He was also a believer in, or not even so much a believer as much as he was an observer and a presenter of what is incorrectly today called cold electricity. Now, cold electricity, which we will go into much later, is actually a very different form of power than so-called electricity because it lacks the magnetic element. However, what I'd like to do before we go any farther is actually show you something that's very interesting. I've always wanted to use these. This is called a Thornson motor. It was developed right around the time that I was born.
The force of inertia is known in mechanics, but until only recently, it had been considered too weak and difficult to harness for propulsion. According to some theorists, like Hal Puthoff, inertia, like gravity, is what occurs when we try to accelerate an object against the zero-point fluctuations in the vacuum. We run into resistance, literally. Canadian inventor Roy Thornson has developed an inertial impulse propulsion engine which overcomes that resistance using centrifugal force. It pushes against nothing and emits no exhaust, but it's been calculated to be 20 times more efficient than a jet engine. Here, the Thornson inertial propulsion drive powers a canoe in a swimming pool. The motor, which is housed in a box, never contacts the water or air. In the pendulum test, unidirectional force is being generated to keep the pendulum to one side.
Whether or not we can demonstrate, as I have, with engineering analysis and models that will climb an incline, will pass a pendulum test, in other words, stay on one side of the pendulum consistently, and even power a canoe in a swimming pool, commercialization of that device is still a very difficult road. And we see that in many inventions, but what I like to emphasize is my F over P measurement of that is literally 20 times better than the jet engine. A jet engine, typically a commercial jet engine, the DC-9, I think is the one that I analyzed, has about 0.016 newtons per watt. And then this is in the metric system. Now, when we look at the Thornson, he's able to achieve 0.32 newtons per watt, literally 20 times better than the jet engine.
Roy Thornson is developing refinements to his system to increase its performance. Unfortunately, like many inventors, even with a U.S. patent in hand, he has yet to find sufficient investment capital to bring his motor to the marketplace.
Propulsion force does in fact exist.
Now, isn't that something incredible? I know that those who may be listening to the podcast and not seeing it may not have been able to view the demonstration, but it is true. The motor, by simple virtue of making use of what we today perhaps somewhat inaccurately refer to as inertia, was able to actually move a canoe consistently from point A to point B across a pool without ever having to contact the water or the air. And that in and of itself is extraordinarily remarkable. Now, some people actually prefer to, believe it or not, before we move on, I would like to actually address a different inventor. This man's name is John Searle. He was an Englishman who lived around the early 20th century. He died in the early 2000s. However, his machine in some ways actually helps us bridge the gap into a whole new topic, which is still relevant because his machine in some ways is the midpoint between these two subjects. Specifically, I'm referring to not just free energy, but also anti-gravity. Now, anti-gravity has often been called one of the other holy grails. If free energy is one, then anti-gravity is another. His machine was actually documented, and I won't play the entire documentary, obviously, it's too long, but I do encourage others to go take a look at that one as well. However, during his time when he was alive in England, he did succeed in actually using this device to create a UFO that we would think of as small enough to be remote controlled, but not one to carry human beings. None of his devices ever carried human passengers, but they were remote control. Photographs were taken by British newspapers, and it made large stories across vast swaths of England during the 50s and 60s. However, what I would like to say is, much like Marco Rodin, who is the inventor of the Rodin coil, his machine does function, but once again, like Joe Newman and many others, his theory might superficially be correct, but ultimately doesn't explain the situation accurately. So his machine, unfortunately, uses atomism in order to explain itself, which is, of course, not true. For example, in the clip that you're about to see visually, I apologize to those of you who are listening and not able to see, the image that you're seeing before you, this torus, or what is called it's called a torus, but for those of you who may not know what a torus is, it's a donut, a very large and inflated donut. And the reason for this is because every atom in the universe, every magnet in the universe, are made up entirely of the conjugate, meaning two working in tandem to become one, fields of dielectricity and magnetism. However, in this particular image of the model that we're seeing, this model is leaving out one important factor. It's showing you the magnetism in the form of the torus, but it's not showing you the dielectricity. The dielectricity is what we would think of as a hyperboloid, which is an hourglass shape. That should be coming in at the top and becoming more and more narrow as it reaches the center of the device, and then reciprocating back out in the opposite form. But because it's not displaying this model is leaving out that important aspect of how this machine functions. So again, I stress that the machine does in fact function, but that the explanation behind it is not completely there. The inventor himself, John Searle, is very hard of hearing, so I apologize when I play this clip. He will have a strong British accent for those of you listening in, but this is how he more or less discovered his formula for how everything functions. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean I agree with it, but it is interesting to hear what he has to share.
But the third day, I was presented a docket to take to the stores, and I saw this tube with a small tube buff. I asked the foreman what that meant. He said, that's 2 squares. So I said, well, what is 2 squares? So he draws 2 by 2, show me 4 squares. 4. And I said to him, it doesn't make sense to me.
What on earth do we have empty squares for? If it's a square, there must be some value there.
You can take a square, if you run the numbers in normal, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that is uniform in. But when you total them up, each row, each column, each diagonal, you'll find they add up different. Putting numbers in random, we come up with a uniform output. Every line, every column, the 2 diagonals come up precisely the same.
Random numbers in squares will produce a uniform total. John Searle would soon call this the law of the squares, nature's way of achieving order from chaos.
I'd like to take a note for a moment to assert that much of John Searle's theory is very similar to that of Marco Rodin's theory, although Marco Rodin's theory is a bit more image-friendly and a lot more dressed in the aesthetically pleasing garb of New Age philosophical aestheticism.
This led to Searle's revelation and gave meaning to his recurring nightmare.
At the age of 14, I looked at my dream. It's a game you all probably know. We call it hopscotch.
The first dream, as I call it, is going to school. On my way to school, a 1.5 mile walk, I would pick up all the children, and just before we get to the school gate, we have what we call a hopscotch patch on the road itself. And it consists of 3 squares, 4, 5, then the odd one 6, then 7 and 8. Now, it's always that type of pattern, and there's a reason for it. I obviously been playing with all the children. It's now my turn. I've reached the point where I throw the pebble in square 3. I have hopped to square 2. My left leg is firmly on the ground. The right leg is now up in the air, about to move across square 3, where the pebble is, into square 4. Suddenly, all the children vanish. In the picture now comes an entirely different ingredient of a steamroller. The village steamroller, the only mobile object I've seen outside a horse and cart. This time it's coming at me from the top of the squares towards me, and it's many times bigger. We have the roller done in 2 massive sections. And it's coming to me and it's saying, stop, think, act. If not, you had it. It's telling me by my leg movement that it's not square 3 I need. Go to square 4. It's square 4 that you've got to calculate out the ingredients. Here is the story of how to do it mathematically. And of course the dream was telling me everything I wanted to know, but I had to find those answers. I had to relate what the dream was.
Is there a podcast going on?
To do. So it's a slow, tedious job. And of course I got the sums wrong on a number of occasions on the start.
From those numbers, John Searle had the exact amount of each ingredient in the rollers and rings of his generator.
Now, every 1 square represents a quantity of a material, and that's very important. This is precisely how I developed the SEG. So I copy nature in every way. I work at trying to think how nature's doing it. And
what he said there was copying nature, seeing how nature does it. There is one other inventor I would like to address who also said these same words, and I would like to address him tonight before we end this podcast. Because his name is Victor Schauberger. Do remind me to give him his own section. I do not want to let his name, of all people, slip through it tonight.
And then produce this object.
The first recurring nightmare had become a dream with meaning. Searle's revelation continued with his second recurring nightmare.
This time it relates to what I'm doing on the way back from school. Here, my job in the evening, after I changed my clothes and had a meal, I have to put the ladder up to the loft, the shed, open the door, get the straw, go and bed the hens down for the night. Now, when I get up this ladder, which is many times longer than normal, the door opens, and now instead of bales of straw, straw stems are laid out as struts of a structure. I am now standing towards the middle part of all this structure. Then suddenly the rim is blazing away afar, so massive that no one could put it out, and it's all around me. But something says, have no fear. You'll be lifted out from the center of that flame.
John would interpret the second dream to mean that the device would be circular and have many struts moving out from the center to the rim. Climbing the long ladder meant understanding the infinite combinations of numbers in squares. Then he would break through the trap door and be at the center of the ring made of straw. The fire meant that there would be great energy at the rim of the device.
And again, his theory is very mathematical, and even if it is mathematically accurate, he doesn't understand the ether. He doesn't understand exactly what is occurring in order to bring about the lifting of the machine. However, he did succeed in creating not only free energy, but also UFO, at least a remote control one, from this craft. And his machine is indeed worth an entire program to discuss it alone, but I would like to move on to some other inventors whom themselves have also succeeded in creating anti-gravity for the sake of longevity of our episode. Aside from John Searle's device, there were two other inventors in his time, one in America and one in Russia, who also succeeded in creating anti-gravity on their own, albeit with different methods. One of them actually has to do with the previous program we had. Sorry about that. One of them was actually a gentleman in America whom we will address first. His name was Thomas Townsend Brown. He was an American engineer whom was very clever. However, once again, his theory is not quite accurate, but at this point it's practically verbose. And what I'd like to do is actually see if I can figure out exactly where his clip is in this section. Give me a moment. But anyway, it is widely believed, especially by others such as Jess Fritsch, that Thomas Townsend Brown, or T. Townsend Brown's work, was instrumental in being able to create the prototypes of technology that we today know gave birth to the B-2 bomber, the United States' secret little weapon. But that's obviously classified technology declassified technology by this point. Aside from Thomas Townsend Brown, which, if you'll give me just a moment, I'm attempting to find exactly where his moment in this documentary is, because I do know that it's here. It has a rather interesting take on the matter. Now, in regards to some of his earlier work, believe it or not, there's a form of anti-gravity device that we have built not only on a regular basis, but you can actually find hundreds, literally hundreds of videos all over YouTube and the whole of the internet to this day, using the creation of a device called an ion lifter. Ion lifters are a very small, very simple kite-like device that's made with copper wire, some aluminum, and some sticks. It's a very crude and incoherent device, but it is nevertheless a form of anti-gravity. However, there seems to be a level of disagreement about the device, and I encourage everyone to take some time. Make an ion drive for yourself. The detractors of these devices insist, well, it's not really anti-gravity, you're not really using gravity to make the device lift, that's just the air, they say. Well, here's the problem with that. That argument doesn't hold. It doesn't hold for several reasons. First and foremost, the device has been tested in vacuumed environments with no air at all. So with that being said, the device not only functioned better in an environment with no air, better, not worse, but better, it completely nullifies the argument that it is simply a matter of, quote, the air that's lifting the device. Completely blows it away. And furthermore, if we look at the fact of the matter, what you will see is that, before I play this clip of Brown, it's an argument that's akin to trying to say that the that the cart or the wagon is pushing the horse. And that just doesn't hold. The air itself requires something to be ionizing it, but again, the air is not the mechanism here, and I'd like to refer to this clip for just a moment before we move on to something else.
Are we clever enough to learn from the clues our planet is providing?
He called it electrogravitics.
Upon the foundation of innovative thinkers and inventors like Tesla and Moore, the modern age of free energy research began. In the 1950s, as waves of flying saucer sightings occurred throughout the United States, and while an infant space program was trying to catch up with the Russians' launch of Sputnik, a man named T. Townsend Brown was busy on experiments that defied conventional understanding about electricity, gravitation, and propulsion. Along with Drs. Paul Byfield and Agnew Bonson, Brown took high voltage to the next extreme. In this rare home movie, the earliest experiments in electrogravitics are recorded. By using high voltages over 20,000 and up to 200,000 volts, Brown discovered that highly charged capacitors would exhibit a noticeable thrust in one direction. Although awarded a patent for his electrokinetic generator, no one has ever reproduced his experiment until recently. Larry Davenport, shown here demonstrating his replication of Brown's electrokinetic apparatus, explains.
But when I first began to read Brown's stuff, I didn't quite understand the difference between the ion wind devices, which there's a lot of them out there, and some of them are very efficient as far as producing ion wind, and his particular apparatus. I finally decided to do Brown's work in 1994. I looked at his device. I'd tried several different things and they hadn't worked, and I thought, well, Brown is supposed to be the pioneer of this, or so the people that make the claims in that get the patents, they always refer to his name. So I thought, I'll go back and I'll try to do this. Getting it balanced was real important.
His method of propulsion specifically was using the charge separation, high voltage charge separation on a vehicle. He found that circular craft were better for that application than winged craft. However, recently we found through Dr. Paul LaViolette's research that the B-2 bomber actually seems to qualify as an electrogravitic craft. The military has admitted that it electrically charges the forward leading edge of the wings. There's also a very high dielectric being used. Depleted uranium is used on the forward edge of the wings. And whether or not there are other applications for that technology in that design, we're recognizing that because the exhaust gas is also negatively ionized, that all of a sudden we have the high voltage charge separation that's necessary to provide an extra propulsive force, especially at high velocities. So electrogravity in that aspect is a very simple process, but does provide a good amount of force for a very small amount of energy input.
As with many other promising inventions developed during the Cold War years, the National Secrecy Act prevented scientists like T. Townsend Brown from commercializing or even publicizing any technology which could potentially be interpreted as having a military application. The triumph of America's space exploration program gave way to the era of limits in the late 70s.
Now, with that being said, there have been, as I've said before, many, many people to this day who've made ion lifters at home. We can make one right now. But the problem with the ion lifter in its conventional state is that it's a very incoherent device. You see, when I say coherent, what I mean is, if you look at the difference between the traditional LED light bulb, which is a point source device, this is the opposite, meaning, well, point source meaning it derives from one place, like the sun. The sun is also considered a point source example of light, point source light. Whereas with Edison's incandescent light bulbs, those were dual sourced and thus created incoherent light. There have been those today, and this is important and worth noting because I'm trying to give an example here. If you look at the LED lights we have today, you'll hear some ophthalmologists and optometrists say that direct LED exposure is actually not good for your eyes. And the reason for this is because point source light is essentially an LED. An LED being point source light is actually a laser pointer without a focusing lens. That's the only difference. And that should say something to people. The only difference between a laser and an LED is a focusing lens. That's all. So it is worth noting that much like the difference between this device and Ken Wheeler's anti-gravity toys, which are point source, they are far more stable and able to sustain themselves. Brown's ion lifters are essentially the equivalent, in terms of the field, they are the equivalent of the incandescent bulb. They work, they'll fly, but it's very difficult to control them. That's not to say that with modifications they couldn't overcome this. It's not that difficult. You just have to have the resources and the money. But the fact is, in its base form, it's the equivalent of what we would think of being the incandescent bulb of anti-gravity. It's incoherent and is in requirement for certain specifications in order to control it. And another reason why ion lifters haven't taken off in a more grandiose manner is simply because they require lots of electricity, or at least high voltage, that is, and free energy would far more than one would think, open up the avenues to allow this to become a reality. Now, if we take a side note for just a moment, some people say, well, I don't want to use electrical. I'd prefer something more like water or hydrogen. Let's take a look at something called the GEAT before we move on to our third anti-gravity man, Viktor Grabinikov from Russia. Let's take a small detour into this section here.
The infamous energy crisis made us all aware of our dependence on finite resources.
Many inventors promised dramatic results with devices they said would solve the crisis. Claims of over-unity, where power output exceeds input, were routinely announced. But when put to the test, most of their crude prototypes performed poorly, or not at all. Measuring methods were, and still are, extremely difficult to perform accurately. The few that did achieve modest gains in output were dismissed by mainstream academia and denied patents. And without patent protection, investors have no financial incentive to lay out the millions of dollars it takes to mass produce and market these devices, no matter how promising the technology. And after all, classical Newtonian dynamics got us to the moon, and Einstein's E = mc squared explained that energy could neither be created nor destroyed.
For the record, that's a lie.
Anything else which seemed otherwise was labeled perpetual motion, unworthy of scientific examination.
When I started out in 1980, free energy was something that we didn't talk about.
With that in mind, I'd like to move on. Before we enter Viktor Grabinikov, I'd like to point to a gentleman whom is of interest. He's named John Hutchison. He actually succeeded in creating something rather remarkable, and believe it or not, there are very obvious and open tutorials on how to create his Hutchison crystal batteries. Take a look at this. The man is a bit eccentric, but his experiments are nothing short of almost quasi-magical.
As if the amazing over-unity results of these pioneering inventions are not enough, a curious combination of side effects to free energy research involves such things as the transmutation of metals, the formation of new isotopes, and yes, even anti-gravity. Levitation effects from spinning magnetic disks conjure up images of UFOs hovering in midair. British inventor John Searle has led the way along these lines, but his technique is not the only approach. The remarkable works of Canadian inventor John Hutchison has drawn widespread attention from businessmen and government scientists since 1979, when he began using ultra-high electromagnetic frequencies to transform matter in some very unusual ways. It has come to be known as the Hutchison Effect.
The objects you're seeing moving there is a form of levitation by translational movement, meaning that the...
Let me say this for the sake of clarity. Hutchison is a brilliant tinkerer. His inventions and his experiments are extraordinarily remarkable, but his explanations have virtually zero credibility, in my opinion. Again, this doesn't take away from the legitimacy of his experiments, which, again, are incredible, but his explanations are nothing short of silly.
Objects become lighter and can float around, the heaviest being the barium cylinder that you see there, with the two wires coming out of it. Tends to slide around on 7 pounds of its own weight. Physics of it is self-resonation of what they call ferromagnetic and piezoelectric barium titanate through a power amplifier and broad and narrow bands of electrical energy going into this crystal. So the applications of this in advanced applications using free energy or zero-point energy to power it would be in propulsion technologies. This is a crystal converter unit that I made about a year ago to see if the principle worked, and indeed it seems to work to this day. The principles involve the Casimir effect and space charge type of barrier technology in semiconductors.
There, again, I will stress that there are recipes and plenty of guides on YouTube and the internet showing people right now how to make Hutchison crystal batteries, if you wish to go see for yourself.
And a jitter activity called zero-point energy that goes through time and space. The idea is to get the material inside this to interface with the jittering action of zero-point energy. And moving on to what they may look like inside, I actually bring out a piece here of this material, of common minerals and that, produced in a special way, and I take a reading here. And I should be getting a higher reading. I had a hot spot somewhere on here. I have here almost a half a volt, as you can see. As one can see, there's no batteries in this or anything else except this crystalline material.
John Hutchison's crystal batteries actually produce a high amperage, low voltage current.
Different configurations. And this is a steady state. It's always that, and has been tested up to a year's time and under stress tests also. So, which made me decide to then, of course, mount the same material in cylinders. Different cylinders, of course, there are different mixes in there, and I found that that some of the cylinders are not as powerful as this material here, or this very tiny one here. Actually, this has more power than this large artillery shell unit here. And what I want to do, of course, is to demonstrate it in the sense of it making actual power. And that means to turn a small motor. Okay, I'm attaching this to the base here. Another lead to the top, and it should spin, which it does. So yeah, basically, this kind of material powering motors. Of course, it's a very small motor at this time, but scaled up in larger amounts of material can power up to several horsepower if needed.
Hutchison hopes his simple shake-and-bake method of producing these crystal energy converters will attract investors who can see the potential of permanent batteries which never need charging.
Never.
And toxic, that will interface with zero-point energy in space and time.
Hutchison's more dramatic experiments border on the paranormal and have generated more than just a passing interest from U.S. military research labs.
We've had about 750 demonstrations of levitations, translational movements, metallurgical samples falling apart, changing into transmuted unknown metals. Quite a variety of obscure types of effects, wood impregnated into metals, other objects in metals, monopole magnetic fields written up in many journals, actions, let's say, to gravitational waves and time waves, or chronons, if you wish.
There is no such thing as a chronon.
Perhaps we're dealing in chronons and gravitons, which are maybe particles, and somehow causing a distortion, which causes objects to simply break apart or pulsate in the center of stainless steel bars and fall apart, or to become weightless.
Here, ice cream in a plastic cup.
You see that? You actually just observed ice cream dripping upward. Upward.
Now, when we analyze that, we find that there's position versus time graph that we can plot, and also the velocity versus time. But when we actually analyze the acceleration versus time, it's an increasing straight line. So we're forced as scientists to admit that we have a third derivative effect, which, for my mind, actually lends itself to an anomalous new force, which I call hyperforce, because we have to take a derivative of that to finally get a flat, straight line, a constantly increasing acceleration. So the Hutchison effect has been used as a benchmark for a comparison to many other high-voltage propulsion devices. Electrogravity, in other words.
So with that piece, it's very dramatic, and again, although many of his explanations are just flat out wrong, in my opinion, it doesn't take away from how incredible his experiments really were. However, now that we've covered that, I'd like to move on to the third and final man of remarkable anti-gravitational accomplishment. This man was a Russian named Viktor Grabinikov. Now, Viktor Grabinikov was a very interesting fellow. He lived in the Soviet Union for a time, but his anti-gravity device is interesting insofar that it was made not from traditional electrical components, but, believe it or not, from insect components. But this makes total sense if one understands the dielectric. This is how this functions. If one examines the humble beetle shell, what we see today in nature, in the world of entomology, the study of insects, it's well established as a fact among many entomologists that we've never been able to understand how or why certain beetles have been able to fly. And the reason for this is because our current understanding of their flapping insectoid wings hidden underneath the Carapace chitin shell should not be strong enough to lift certain forms of beetles. They're simply too heavy, and the wings too small and too weak to be able to lift them. So what exactly is the mystery here? Well, the world of entomology can't explain how certain beetles are able to fly, because it defies their understanding. The reason for this, before we reach Grabinikov's actual video, which I assure you won't be very long, one has to understand this principle. Bismuth crystal, which everyone is familiar with, there are little devices called levitators that others have made, and you can look up videos of this on the internet, where with specially positioned bismuth, we're able to place certain magnets in between specially arranged bismuth structures, which results in magnets perpetually spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning around in a perpetual spin with no power input. Although technically this would count as a free energy device, most would say, well, there's no way to harness that. You don't need to. But in any case, bismuth, in its highly colorful state, as it is, as a crystal, is the universe's most diamagnetic material, meaning it hates magnetism but loves dielectricity. Now, what is the purpose of this? This is what makes it very special and will make it actually ideal for use in anti-gravitational technology when one understands the ether. With that being said, we're all familiar with how the bismuth displays a wide variety of colors. This is because of its incredible, as I said, the universe's most diamagnetic material, because of its incredibly high dielectric permittivity. This is why it displays the colors that it does. There's one other source in nature on planet Earth where we see a substance do this, and it's in, believe it or not, certain beetle shells. Those iridescent colors displayed by those insect chitin shells and the carapace does the same thing as the bismuth. The insects, I attest strongly, and I assert very sternly, the insects as an explanation that entomologists have never been able to solve as to how certain beetles are able to fly when their wings simply should not be able to carry them, is because when they open the carapace shell, those chitin wings, which are highly dielectric, are doing almost the same exact thing as that B-2 bomber, maybe even more effectively so. They are making use of anti-gravity. Those beetles are. But instead of the electric eel, which is using its body to create electricity, these beetles are using their body's natural currents to create dielectric, not electric, effects. And that is what is giving them lift. It is the flapping wings under the carapace that is only made for steering them, not lifting them. And I will attest to this very sternly. Let us take a moment to examine Viktor Grabinikov's story.
Previously would not have intermingled. For his part, Grabinikov was an intelligent, curious young man, and he became among the first of a new educated generation. It was this education that led him, as an adult, to Novosibirsk, on the southern tip of the western Siberian plain. There, Grabinikov took to a wide range of interests, becoming a scientist, specifically an entomologist, which is the study of insects, but also a naturalist, painter, and rugged outdoorsman. He may also have been a poet, judging by how he described the natural beauty of the Siberian steppe. The high of
We'll just move along.
Under the stars. The entire steppe is dappled with their holes like Swiss cheese, and in places almost like a sponge. What could this mean? Grabinikov wondered. He returned to the spot 4 more times.
Let's back up just a little bit.
Overcome with the vast steppe, along with his intent to camp under the stars. As he laid his head on a makeshift pillow, Grabinikov was overcome with an unpleasant feeling. A headache, ringing ears, and a metallic taste in his mouth. He realized that he had set up camp on top of an underground bee city, that, in fact, in his own words, the entire steppe is dappled with their holes like Swiss cheese, and in places almost like a sponge. What could this mean? Grabinikov wondered. He returned to the spot 4 more times, through varying weather and times of day, and each time found the results the same. He noted that 5 meters away from the boundary of the bee city, he felt no effects. But as soon as he entered the area, he felt similarly unpleasant. This weighed on Grabenikov's mind for some time, until years later, he happened to be in an area where another bee city had recently died, that is, collapsed as a result of erosion and the passage of time. While investigating the site, Grabinikov collected parts of the nest, the familiar honeycomb, and returned to his office. There he noticed the most unusual phenomenon. When he put his hand over the honeycomb, he could feel a heat emanating from it, a thermal sensation which made him lightheaded. He got others to try, and they reported similarly feeling heat or cold wind, having numbness in their fingers, or feeling as though their hand was being pushed around. Most peculiar, the cause of this could not be measured by any traditional scientific device. Grabinikov noted that thermometers or ultrasound detectors, magnetometers, and electrometers did not respond to them in the slightest. Further, the effect could not be blocked by covering, even with a thick piece of metal. Strangely, clocks, both mechanical and electronic, started running inaccurately when placed near the zone.
Now that in and of itself is worth noting, and it makes me feel personally that Grabinikov's story is legitimate and that he is not a faker. But they expand upon this more.
By chance, Grabinikov had discovered the cavity structural effect, CSE, which is what he called this type of force field which surrounded cavernous honeycomb-like objects. Believing this to be an important and potentially groundbreaking discovery, Grabinikov published an article on his findings. Surprisingly, the article went unnoticed or ignored in the mainstream scientific community. Thus, Grabinikov was left to continue the work himself. While his status as an entomologist was probably at least partially responsible for the indifference of the scientific community, it was this vocation that allowed Grabinikov his next major breakthrough, a discovery that would change everything. In 1988, Grabinikov was examining the chitin shells of insects under a microscope when he noticed what he called an unusually rhythmic, extremely ordered, incomparable honeycomb, solid multidimensional composition, which looked as if it was pressed by some complicated automatic machine. As he moved deeper into study, something extraordinary happened. As Grabinikov described, I was about to place a second identical plate with the same unusual cell structure on its underside, almost purposely on top of the first one. But then, the little plate came loose from my tweezers, hung suspended above the other plate on the microscope stage for a few seconds, then turned a few degrees clockwise and swung, and only then it abruptly fell on the desk. When I came to my senses, I tied a few panels together with a wire, and it wasn't an easy thing to do. I succeeded only when I positioned them vertically. What I got was a multi-layered chitin block, and I placed it on the desk. Even a relatively large object, such as a thumbtack, would not fall on it. Something pushed it up and aside. When I attached the tack on top of the block, I witnessed incredible, impossible things. The tack would disappear from sight for a few moments. That was when I realized that this was no beacon, but something entirely different. This incredible discovery got Grabinikov thinking. Science suggested that some bugs should be too big to fly, based on the size of their wings and the speed of their wings' beat. Was the cavity structural effect caused by this incomparable honeycomb creating some sort of anti-gravity field, allowing the bugs to defy physics and fly? Were the bugs, in fact, not flying at all, but levitating. Following this line of thought and the works of past scientists like Nikola Tesla, Grabinikov set about trying to create some sort of anti-gravitational vehicle. For years he toiled, pouring heart and soul into the project, until finally he came up with something possessing apparently amazing characteristics. By attaching hundreds, if not thousands of chitin shells to the bottom of a simple wooden platform, Grabinikov had invented an anti-gravity vehicle which he claimed could travel at up to 1,500 kilometers per hour.
Now, there are two things I would like to address regarding his vehicle before we move on to someone else. Grabinikov himself reported a whole series of unique experiences that lend a great deal of credence to me, simply because the observations are too accurate to be a pure result of conjuration of the mind, one of which was slowed time. When he would go out for a ride on this device, which apparently the device was featured on Soviet television one time, though I don't have access to that clip at the moment. During this time, before he left, he would check his watch and the clock on the wall. Both his watch and the clock on the wall would reflect the same time. After he would go onto the device, and according to his own words alone, he would fly around at incredible speeds, but his hat and hair would not be messed up. He himself seemed almost protected by something, so he never experienced what we would think of as an incredible G-force that simply didn't exist, or at least not for him. Once he would return to his home, his watch and the clock on the wall would reflect different times, when they had clearly reflected the same time before he left to begin with. So what does this demonstrate? What it demonstrates is an effect that we would refer to as slowed time. This is caused by electromagnetic retardation, or what is called the Lamore frequency. This is a known phenomenon that we use every day to be able to tune and specify the functions on many MRI machines that are used in hospitals all over the world. That same phenomenon with the Lamore frequency plays a great role in the realm of anti-gravity. Let us move on with Grabinikov, and when we are done with Grabinikov, there are two other inventors I would like to touch on tonight before we end this program.
As many as 300 meters off the ground. He operated the device by stepping on the platform and using two handles attached to the base by a single pole. Despite the incredible speeds, the rider did not experience any effects, no inertia properties or dynamic pressure, almost as if they were ensconced in a bubble or force field. Further, when in flight, the device was invisible from below, appearing as only a light sphere or cloud in the sky.
This is caused by the heavy ionization of the ambient gases around the craft, and this is the same reason why UFOs themselves are also going to appear, and do appear, as bright lights in the sky at night, because the incredible amount of energy that's being oscillated, so to say, in the field around the craft is resulting in the ionization of the air, causing it to fluoresce.
Observers noticed that even his shadow was missing when in flight, and his watch was constantly shifting forward or backward. We know from Einstein that time, space, and gravity are intertwined.
That's not the case.
Humble in the face of such a potentially world-changing invention, Grabinikov believed that so-called real science should investigate his discovery. Thus, he filed for a patent. Shockingly, his patent application was resoundingly denied, while Grabinikov was rejected and called out by skeptics and other scientists.
The Soviet system was responsible, just as we have been responsible, for the outright oppression of many, many great men of accomplishment. However, before we move on from Grabinikov, I'd like to say that anti-gravity is not something that has singularly been accomplished by only one man. He is merely the third gentleman in our program to have done this. Between Grabinikov and John Searle and Thomas Townsend Brown, each of these men present us with a full picture, albeit pieces of a full picture of gravity, but it doesn't fully explain the phenomena in its entirety, because unfortunately none of these men, although their inventions do in fact work, none of them understood the ether, and thus they had to create explanations with the only system of understanding that was allotted to them or that they learned. Now, on a lighter note, I would like to move on to an interesting gentleman who has often been called the Tesla of water. His name is Victor Schauberger. He was an Austrian nationalist. He lived during the early 20th century, of course, but his accomplishments in the realm of water are considered as monumental as Tesla's accomplishments with electricity. Let's take a look.
Inserted a copper plate and a forest of simple comprehend hardly any resistance.
Become homogeneous, so we don't have so much trouble with snail damage. It simply makes the work a lot easier. I recommend.
Comprehend.
Here we go. This is a type of plow that was invented by Schauberger. It's made entirely of copper. John Searle, like Victor Schauberger, two men of accomplishment, both say the same thing: comprehend and copy nature. Nature will provide us with all the answers we need. All we have to do is pay attention. The twister or vortex that is present in all of Victor Schauberger's work is very important, because it is the ether itself and the ether's, well, let me rephrase that. It is the pressure mediation by which all of the ether functions. And this is why the spiral appears virtually everywhere in nature, from the actual Fibonacci sequence to the human eye, and virtually everywhere, even the shape of the galaxy, all reflects the Fibonacci sequence. This has also given rise to what is called so-called spiral theory. But this is only a superficial observation. It is not a complete understanding, but it is on the right track. I think it's become quite obvious that clearly Schauberger had some lovely ideas. However, apart from even his accomplishments in water, he also created an engine which others have attempted to replicate. This replicates, without blades, the same effect that we have with helicopters. As I've said to you in the past, many have incorrectly believed that helicopters are held aloft in the air due to air being blown downward, but that's not actually the case. Helicopters are held in the air by virtue of creating a null point or vacuum effect above the chopper. This is the same effect that Schauberger was able to accomplish with a plane engine he developed. In this particular plane engine, which again used no blades whatsoever, he was able to create a plane engine that pulled rather than pushed the plane. And this was so much more efficient, because Schauberger, like myself, was a devout believer in the idea that explosion technology, or impetus, or the release of fire, or the release of energy in its expenditure, is in fact the mark of evil. It does not represent nature. It represents entropy, death, and the finality of something. But even Schauberger himself was a very gifted man, and like Tesla, he also claimed to be able to actually interact with the ether with his own spirit, and that is where many of his inspirations for his inventions actually come from. He stated this himself on multiple occasions, but unfortunately, he, like many other inventors, was taken advantage of, and he died, unfortunately, a bitter, broken man. Now, for the moment, I would like to shift away from Schauberger to two more examples of some gentlemen before we end this podcast. I'd like to change the window to this little number. This is about a produce manager in Australia. These are the producers of some of the largest strawberries and much of other types of produce in the whole of Australia, because if we take a moment away from them for just a moment, back in the 1970s and 80s, and possibly even the 90s, there were two Christian scientists named Dr. Walter Rawls and Dr. Roy Davis. These two gentlemen wrote several groundbreaking books, a number of them actually, but some of these books were considered so groundbreaking and so incredible based on their experimentation and documented laboratory results alone that their books were suppressed by the federal government. However, today, with the advent of the internet, obviously, we now have access to many of their digitized works. The two books that they wrote were called, well, they wrote many books, but the two books I'm specifically referring to that deal with this subject we're moving on to actually were called Magnetism and Its Effects on the Living System and The Magnetic Blueprint for Life. One of the things that these two scientists discovered quite clearly in their work was that magnetized water, as well as the different exposures to the different ends of the poles of different magnets, had dramatic effects on not just life, but a whole host of instances. And I would like to offer an explanation for what we are about to see. But the current video I'm about to play is actually by... is actually by an Australian produce company whom continue this practice to this day. Take a look.
Farmers are not easily impressed by claims about anything, so when big claims were made for the powers of magnetised water, sceptical might be an understatement. Then they tried it. Frank Pangello reports.
Look at these beautiful big strawberries growing with the magic water, and they taste beautiful as well.
We're getting better quality fruit, getting bigger yields, and you're saving water. You can't beat that.
Could this be the answer to the nation's water crisis and the salvation of our parched and shrivelling gardens?
Farmers will love it, absolutely love it, they do. Environmentalists will love this technology. Industrialists, all those people looking to reduce carbon emissions will love it. Therefore, government will love it. And even people at home will love this technology.
The technology is ever so simple, treating water with powerful magnets. Farmers across Australia are raving about the results.
What do you think of that? They are beautiful, aren't they?
And thanks to using that water.
Yeah, it is. And without that, I don't think we'd have this. We've never had them like this before, so...
What's more, it also has scientists excited. But more about that shortly. First, the hands-on experience of those using it. When you first heard about it, were you a bit sceptical?
Very sceptical. We always thought that, put it in, see what happens, it probably won't work. 8 weeks later, we're just blown away.
Chances are you've probably enjoyed Jim Rapepi's strawberries. ASD is the biggest supplier in the country. Jim's been using magnetic water on his farms in Victoria for almost a year.
This block's always been our driest block. We've always had a lot of trouble getting the moisture into the soil. And we put the magnetic water system through, and within 6 weeks we found that the block was actually a lot more wetter than the rest of the blocks, and we actually had to back off watering.
So you save water?
Oh, definitely. We'll save between 25–30%.
The water is pumped through magnets fixed inside this pipe, but it's what's coming out at the other end that has growers like Jim scratching their head in amazement. Do you use it just on the farm? You use it in the home as well?
Yeah, we actually got magnets for our own use in the house. It's healthy. Have a shower. My wife's noticed the difference even in her washing. She's using less soap.
Griffith citrus and grape grower John Violi's computerised irrigation system has given him an accurate comparison of his water use before and after installing the magnetic system.
We've noticed much better overall plant vigour, much better plant health. We've seen bunch weights now reaching harvest going 40 to 50% heavier than they were last year. It's quite evident that the technology works.
And just up the road, Randy Amaro, Australia's largest rock melon supplier, has picked an incredible 30,000 more melons on this 20-hectare patch using magnetised water, compared with another field nearby using regular irrigation water.
At first I thought it was a lot of bull, but the proof's in the melons. We're getting more melons. Very surprising. No, the quality of the melons, everything was up above the crop beside it. And
many farmers that have implemented the systems have already had such significant benefits, they've paid for their systems many times over.
Farmers have been reporting, including crop yields increasing up to 23%, boosting growth in some plants while using less water.
The scientific research proves that it's true and how and why it's true, and it works. And that has been supported by controlled trials by our farmers in the field.
Water, vital to the health of every living thing on the planet. Magnetism, vital to the health of the planet itself. What happens when you bring together these two vital elements of life on Earth? Something quite miraculous. As you can see, these beautiful flowers are thriving, and they have to because this is a professional flower farm. A&L Florist and Nursery in Sydney's Bosley Park is an established business that delivers to between 40 and 50 outlets a day. To help satisfy that constant demand, owner John Olivieri has turned to an amazing technological breakthrough, magnetic water. This funnel is specifically designed and constructed to magnetize the water as it passes through, causing the water to become biologically active. European studies have confirmed the claimed benefits of magnetizing water, ranging from improved health, relief from arthritic pain, and increased mobility.
Now, I'd like to take a moment to stress one thing. Most of these people are willing to show you the results of these experiments, but I don't believe that many of them fully understand what is actually occurring. The truth of the matter is, and I'd like to stress this before we return to Rawls and Davis, is this. The gentlemen whom we have observed, what they are doing is in fact ionizing the water by causing the hydrogen molecule, which is the building block of all matter in the universe, to become coherent. As a magnet passes through the water, the polarized hydrogen molecules are aligning, making the water coherent, what we call coherent rather than incoherent, coherent water. Coherent water. And one other thing that one can do with coherent water, which the use of these is simply limitless, but one of them is actually, believe it or not, cleaning your clothes. Dennis Lee himself produced, among his inventors who worked with him, laundry magnets that will clean your clothes without the use of detergents, because water is not only something necessary for life, it's also the ultimate form of solvent. And that's not my opinion, that's well established. It is not the detergent in your clothes that's cleaning your clothes, it's the detergent that is ionizing the water. But this same effect can be accomplished by magnetizing the water. And for the record, I have actually used laundry magnets, and I can tell you from a personal standpoint, they absolutely do work. I've had very good experiences with that. However, back to magnetism specifically and the inventions involving them. Rawls and Davis, the two scientists who were responsible for the numerous experiments over the 70s, 80s, and 90s, what these gentlemen found, although some of their observations are incorrect, they are nevertheless interesting to study. And what they found was that consistently with virtually every form of life that they had ever fostered, from plants to insects to worms, even chickens and small mammals. No matter what, anything that was raised and exposed for long periods of time in controlled experiments, thousands of controlled experiments, always came up the same. Those forms of life exposed to the north pole of a magnet, and many people actually don't know this, but the north and south poles of magnets are not arbitrary. There are distinct characteristic differences between them that many of our electronic pole testing devices are able to detect. That's why you can buy an electronic pole tester today and aim it at either side of the magnet, and the pole tester will be able to say north or south, because they are different, qualitatively different. With that being said, those exposed to the north pole of the magnets had greatly experienced an insurmountable and shocking level of retarded growth. And again, this was not simply one or two experiments. This was done thousands of times. A great degree of growth retardation in worms, chickens, and even an experiment involving human injuries or infections or even cancer were observed in these experiments. However, those other controlled examples who were exposed to the south pole of the magnetic field experienced the opposite. Not only did human tissue, when injured, heal much faster when exposed to the south pole of a magnet, those forms of life that were exposed themselves not only grew larger, stronger, and more healthy and faster, and proliferated much greater than they would have normally. They exceeded normal growth patterns. And this is an experiment that anyone, to this day, with powerful magnets can do themselves. You don't have to take my word for it. You can do it yourself. Oh, there we go. Audio. Anyway, so what does this mean? The reason for this, which unfortunately Rawls and Davis themselves had incorrect observations, they erroneously believed that a magnet was producing two different types of energy out both ends, but that's not actually the case. What's actually happening is the same energy is present in both poles, but the difference is on the north pole, it is pulling dielectricity like a vacuum out of the universe, while on the south pole, it is blowing dielectricity back in to the universe. This is the difference. One side of the magnet is more or less a fountain, while the other side is a vacuum. If you want to look at it from the example that was taught to me, you have to think of it as a shower and a drain, but the difference is the more water pressure that comes out of the shower head, the more equal suction is going to occur in the drain pipe where the water goes. And that is exactly what's going on here. Even in particular, and this is just one of a great many examples, they conducted an interesting experiment on worms. The worms that were exposed to the South Pole, as expected, experienced a great, enormous boom in growth and activity, and were imbued with much vigor. But those exposed to the North Pole became so weak and agitated and disturbed by the environment they were trapped in that they actually ate their way through the paper cup, fell on the floor, and died in a desperate attempt to leave the field. And this was a very dramatic event for Rawls and Davis. But these men's experiments, replicable, easily replicable to this day, are only now available for everyone on the internet to read, because at least at the time when their experiments were published, their books were suppressed, according to Ken Wheeler, by the federal government. And this is absolutely worth looking into. But if one is looking for an explanation, the explanation that I will offer is this. Magnetodielectricity, which makes up the volume of all matter in the universe, is being affected by these magnets. As I said before, one is a fountain and one is a drain. And it is worth noting that today you can actually buy what are called shark bands, magnets that you can wear around your wrist or your ankle to help keep sharks away from you. With that being said, one of the experiments that Rawls and Davis had allegedly, which I have not taken the time to read about, but one of the experiments that these men had allegedly conducted was in being able to view a north pole of a magnet showing signs of being able to retard the growth of cancer and infections. Which brings us to the final inventor of the night, one I have spoken of in great detail before. A gentleman you've heard me speak of named Royal or Dr. Royal Raymond Rife. Dr. Rife was a remarkable man, and I would argue very, very sternly that he should be, even though he's not, he should be hailed as one of the greatest medical inventors and medical practitioners in human history, without any stretch of the imagination. Now, I won't necessarily go into all information regarding him, because perhaps he deserves his own podcast in and of himself. However, what I shall do is play at least a clip or so of one of the very poignant documentaries that details his accomplishments. But his accomplishments for the uninitiated who may be unfamiliar with him, or for those who may be listening to this podcast or watching this podcast and not know who he is. Dr. Rife was a medical genius who lived in the early part of the 20th century. Among those who understand his work, he is accredited with not only conclusively discovering once and for all what cancer actually is, unequivocally, regardless of a whole host of different theories that, once again, may be somewhat true, but in the end still falling short of the entire mark of what cancer actually is. Even before the advent of the polio vaccine, Reif's accomplishments in the use of a device that he, again, this is the 30s we're talking about, he called this device the beam ray machine. What this device did, which in his death they've been renamed or rebranded Rife machines after him, what these devices do is, using a noble gas-filled bulb, create an oscillating ripple in all directions, an electromagnetic wave in all directions. As to which type of wave, I don't recall off the top of my head. It may be a square wave, it may be any number of them, but regardless of his of that particular detail, many studies were conducted with his work. And I would like to actually go into this particular one. Now, this documentary is called actually, before we go into that one, I'd like to play a different piece. But the way in which his machine functions is very simple. By pumping a simple frequency-generated signal, an electrical power source, into this noble gas bulb, one is able to create a field in all directions that is able to resonate with certain molecular structures. And what Rife himself, through accident, discovered was that different forms of microbial life resonate at specific frequencies that he himself could match with this device. And this gave him the means to treat the microbe, regardless of what it was, with such a surgical precision that would enable him to zero in on that microbe and that microbe alone and destroy it in the same way that we observe superficially a wine glass or any form of glass being destroyed by a stereo when the right pitch of frequency from that sound generator matches that of the molecular structure of the glass, causing it to shatter. That same effect can be replicated in the electromagnetic spectrum on these microbial life. And the amount of evidence supporting Reif's work is monumental. It's absolutely monumental. However, going into what happened to him and his device deserves its own podcast alone. His story is very extensive. But what I'd like to do is play a shorter video for the moment, and I promise to keep this one brief, in demonstrating how the device actually functioned. Currently streaming. There we go.
Everything vibrates. Everything. Our reality is such that frequencies have a much more profound effect on us than we've been previously led to believe. This basic fundamental fact can no longer be ignored. As technologically advanced as we're constantly told we are these days, there are some technologies that are just now being presented to the public as new when they're not new at all, but have simply been widely suppressed for decades. Things like the new digital neuro headbands that pulse specific electromagnetic frequencies into a person's head to change people's moods, for example. People are buying these now. This is a thing. But it was proven that that type of technology worked decades ago. It has also come out in recent years that frequencies can cure diseases, including cancer. Professor Anthony Holland even gave a TED Talk called Shattering Cancer with Resonant Frequencies a couple years back, where he discussed that specific oscillating pulse electrical fields can destroy everything from cancer cells to MRSA.
Over the course of 15 months, we try hundreds and hundreds of frequencies, if not thousands, until we find the magic combination. The answer is you have to have two input frequencies, one low, one high, and the higher frequency must be 11 times the lower. It's what we musicians would call the 11th harmonic. And when we add the 11th harmonic, we begin to shatter microorganisms like a crystal glass.
Not that you probably heard about it on the nightly news or anything. As someone pointed out in the comments on his video, phrases like "they hadn't seen anything like it and it seems to be a new phenomenon" made viewers who know about the organized suppression of such technologies since at least the 1930s want to slam their own heads into a wall. If you haven't heard of Dr. Royal Raymond Rife, this is someone who's been referred to by those who personally knew him as a genius. He was a scientist and inventor, and starting in the 20s, he began building a large and very complex microscope capable of magnifying objects 31,000 times, compared with the maybe 1,700 times that were available on standard microscopes in the 30s and 40s. By 1940, he had invented a 2-foot microscope weighing 200 pounds that included 5,682 parts, which enabled him to see viruses and bacteria in a way that no other scientist had.
Now, I'd like to take a moment to specify something about his microscope. His microscope was actually considered an enormously successful competitor with the so-called scanning electron microscope, which I would argue is a better microscope for examining inorganic substances, or at least it's, to me, not Reif's, but this so-called scanning electron microscope is not a good microscope for microbiology. It might be useful for examining something to the degree of maybe a beetle shell up close, but it's not good for trying to view microbial life. For one reason, in order for the microscope to function, it has to bombard the subject with enormous amounts of dielectricity. This causes the microbes to die. And so, unfortunately, we're left with a snapshot of dead viruses. Reif's microscope was very different. It did not use dielectricity at all. Instead, it used monochromatic light by channeling different frequencies of light through quartz crystal and tunneling it through a complex series of tubes, including one that is filled with glycerin or mineral oil. He was able to separate the bands and bring them back together at a needle point. And in a time when the greatest of microscopes was only able to see at approximately 15,000 magnification, his microscope, the universal microscope as he called it, was actually a form of dark field imaging. That's a type of way of viewing through a microscope, dark field imaging. His dark field imaging universal microscope was actually able to go to upwards of 80,000 magnification in a time when even the greatest of its competitors could only go up to 15. This enabled him, Rife, to become the first man, the first living human being to actually see certain microbes for the first time with his own eyes, and see them not as a snapshot, but as a live, in-person video, where he was able to see them as they moved. This allowed him to view their behavior and their reproductive patterns and behaviors very keenly. And this is where he and his partner, Dr. Arthur Isaac Kendall, were able to develop what was called K-medium. K-medium was a means for doing what at the time was considered impossible, which was growing cancer outside of a human body in a petri dish, actually being able to create it. But let's continue the video just for the moment.
At that time. Because these organisms were so tiny, he designed a method of staining them with light. And through this work, he came to understand that living things, including pathogens and viruses and bacteria, have their own frequency or oscillation pattern. And just like a specific musical note can shatter a wine glass if sung at the resonant frequency of the glass, he found specific frequencies could be used when matched up with specific pathogens in order to destroy them. And as he continued to isolate viruses and bacteria and locate their frequencies, he also claimed he discovered the virus responsible for cancer. Using resonance, or what he termed the mortal oscillatory rate of the virus, he was able to kill it in laboratory experiments over and over and over. He completed hundreds of experiments on tumors in rats purposefully infected with the isolated cancer virus before ever attempting to use these frequencies on people.
Now, I would like to strongly specify something here, because I know that there will be many questions regarding this particular subject. One of those is, how in the world could cancer strictly be a virus? One might ask, well, how? I thought smoking or radiation or chemical exposure, I thought all of that caused cancer. I would like to reserve that for a different podcast. Rife himself deserves his own full podcast in order for all of that information to be explained. It's very extensive, and I do consider myself knowledgeable and quite familiar with the subject, and I would happily give another presentation strictly on Rife and only Rife. So I will not go into answering any great deal of specificity, but I can tell you this. I will argue and stand by my statement that Rife and Kendall were the only human beings in history to ever fully understand what cancer was and how it functioned. And everyone else who came after them fell short of the mark in fully understanding what it was. But that is a subject for another podcast and another day. This is about his inventions.
In 1934, he famously tested out his device on 16 terminally ill cancer patients.
That study was conducted with over a dozen doctors observing the study under the auspices of the Milbank Johnson Foundation in Southern California in 1934. This was not done in somebody's basement. It was not done in someone's garage. This was a controlled study on dying patients who volunteered for the study, and the results were recorded again, by the Milbank Johnson Foundation and by over a dozen doctors present.
Out of 16, 14 of them, all but 2, were certified medically cured in just 3 months. Of his
The other 2, I don't know why she neglected to say this, the other 2 were cured of their cancer 2 months later.
His treatment, Rife would later write, "With the frequency instrument treatment, no tissue is destroyed, no pain is felt, no noise is audible, and no sensation is noticed."
Sensation is noticed depending on what disease you're curing. If you have a localized infection in a singular place, you will, from personal experience, I argue, you will feel it. But it's nothing bad.
A tube lights up, and 3 minutes later the treatment's completed. The virus or bacteria is destroyed, and the body then recovers itself naturally from the toxic effect of the virus or bacteria.
3 minutes was only necessary for their particular circumstances. Today, Rife machines that do work, which there are unfortunately many fraudulent ones that do exist and unfortunately continue to circulate, giving the skeptics their, quote, evidence to hold up their hands and say, look, we tested this device and it doesn't work. I would say to those skeptics, of course it doesn't work. You used something that's fraudulent, an imposter, a fake, a charlatan. That's why it didn't work. You have to be able to separate the good machines that do work from the fake ones that are clouding and muddying the waters. And I will stress that regarding his 3-minute statement, that is not by any stretch of the imagination universal to all treatments that Rife machines are capable of doing today. Many, many treatments will take 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes. Some will even take 70 minutes, depending on what it is you're treating. It's different depending on the different diseases and the severity of the case. Some diseases require a constant barrage of frequencies on a daily basis for weeks or even months. However, there are some that are only a few minutes long and will work after one time. But again, this is dependent on 2 factors, the disease and the severity of it. But I will stand by my statement as a proud owner of a Rife machine that it is real, it is genuine, and it continues to serve me well to this day with my health. And I will stand by it.
Several diseases may be treated simultaneously. His findings were at first widely published. In June of 1940, the LA Times reported, "For organisms too small to be stained, an ingenious illuminating system is used. The system utilizes Rife's theory that organisms respond to certain wavelengths, a theory he carries to finality by bombarding disease germs with radio waves which are tuned to those of the minute man-killers. And the virus he says occurs in cancer has, Rife insists, disintegrated under such radio waves." Rife was hailed in the scientific and medical communities for his discoveries, at first. By 1937, he'd established a company called Beamray with several colleagues, and 14 of his machines were manufactured. Multiple doctors used these machines, tested them out, and saw that they worked.
Technology they have been for a
wasn't
long time.
Just Rife's word. So what happened? Why aren't these machines in every hospital and cancer treatment center in the world today?
Well, the answer to that is very simple. It would render all pharmaceutical drugs, a multi-billion-dollar industry, completely obsolete immediately.
Why don't we have them? Simply put, the only cancer Rife couldn't seem to kill was greed. Powerful opposition with vested interests in allopathic, that is, the pharmaceutical and surgery-based medicine system, and the still infant cancer treatment called chemotherapy, and medical professionals linked to the Rockefeller Foundation with its deeply entrenched eugenics-based population control agenda, would make absolutely sure that Rife's machines would never be available to the public at large.
It is worth noting that one of Rife's more familiar clients who worked with him as intimately as he could with the limited technology of communication they had at the time was actually the King of England's, no less than the King of England's personal physician.
If you notice an absence of stethoscopes, thermometers, and other medical paraphernalia, don't let it upset you. This doctor doesn't go in for them. He's got something better. She doesn't even have to undress. The machine will find out what's wrong. The modern counterpart of the ancient medicine man. He's traded in his boar's tooth and magic wand for an electrical appliance. But his stock in trade is...
Using this particular example that they're showing, I wish to be very specific about something. After Reif's fall from grace, there was a gentleman named John Crane. Crane attempted to replicate Reif's work using not noble gas bulbs that created carrier waves, but using tactile devices of various metals like copper or iron that one had to hold on to or strap to their body some way or another. Rife himself refused to endorse these machines. And I'd like to say that again. Rife himself refused to endorse these machines. But unfortunately, because these machines were created by John Crane, many well-meaning but poorly educated Rife enthusiasts continue to peddle them to this day, even though I will sternly insist right here and now, unequivocally, that they don't work. They're unreliable, and even Rife himself said this. You must have the bulb, the noble gas, the carrier wave that passes through the body in all directions.
Still, ignorance and superstition. The 20th century witch doctor talks in terms of atomic rays and supersonic vibrations.
This is slander.
He's what's generally referred to as a quack doctor. But somehow that term just doesn't cover my feelings on the subject. To me, the term murderer is much more appropriate.
One such big pharma stooge was Dr. Morris Fishbane, head for a time of the American Medical Association, and described by Bob Wallace on LouRockwell.com as a shakedown artist hell-bent on destroying naturopathic medical inventors he couldn't buy out. The story goes that Fishbane sent an attorney to make a token attempt to buy out Rife, and Rife refused. And although no one knows the exact terms of the offer, it was probably similar to the one Fishbane made to Harry Hoxsey for his herbal cancer remedy, which Fishbane later had to admit in court worked on skin cancer.
Hoxsey was another man who invented a genuine cure for cancer and was crushed by Fishbane.
On a television screen, it must look very much like a jar of chocolate syrup. It's not. It's cancer salve, and it's deadly. If it's killed before, it'll kill again. When it doesn't kill, it maims. It never cures.
Fishbane and his associates would receive all the profits for 9 years, and Hoxsey would receive nothing. Then, if they were satisfied it worked, Hoxsey would begin to get 10% profit.
Being that that section is more geared toward Hoxsey, I can safely say this. Regarding Rife and his technology, it again deserves its own podcast, its own section, and his accomplishments are nothing short of incredible. It is a gift to me personally to be able to sit here and stand by the work of this man and say, his machine works. And it, to this day, for those whom have access to it and to those who can find it and those whom are able to use it properly, it has saved many lives. And even in a less dramatic way, it's able to simply help upkeep positive health. I could go into some personal stories, but I feel that that would be more geared toward that episode specifically designed for just that subject. And with that, I'd like to draw this episode to an end and say, all of these inventions, this is what I'd like to close in my closing statement. All of these inventions, for what they are, they share one universal similarity, which is that they've all given us a window or an opportunity to change the world in a multitude of miraculous and incredible ways, but they have all fallen victim to an organized suppression in one way or another. I know that some would question how in the world such a thing could be possible, or how such incredible inventions and such miraculous creations could be kept from humanity? That is more of a psychological than a scientific question. And with that, I say this. They stand to help humanity, to save humanity, and to ease human suffering and advance us deeply into the future. And that's why these fascinate me so much so that I wish to share them with the world and even try to make a few of my own. With that, I hope that this has been enlightening, and I hope that others have learned something. Certainly there's a lot of information to cover, but in the end, every piece of knowledge is simply a breadcrumb or a seed by which, for those who are curious, they can find out more on their own. And I'm confident that the information I've provided this evening has merit.
Thank you very much, Giovanni, for that very interesting and very thorough presentation. We really appreciate it. And thank you for your time. And thank you also, everybody, for listening and attending. And please make sure you have liked, followed, and subscribed to our YouTube channel, the official YouTube channel, where this and all our other podcasts will be uploaded. Thanks again, Giovanni. Thanks, everybody. And have a good night. God bless. We'll see you again here tomorrow for more great podcasts. Keep an eye on the announcements channel on the Temple Mount Discord server. Good night.
Good night.